Welcome to eTree's Enhancements. In this series of videos, we will be going over how to convert a CZ75, SP01 included, and CZ75 compacts into a shadow. Now, this is exclusively to CZ75 models that have the manual thumb safety, not the decocker. The decocker is a completely different story, and we really shouldn't convert it to a shadow model. There's a lot of reasons why I'm not going to get into it, but mainly we are going to be looking at a few different things. There's going to be, again, two parts. The first part is going to be based on the slide itself and the sear cage, while part two is going to be exclusively over fitting a shadow hammer into the frame. Now, all the parts that were ordered for this specific video came out of CZ Custom. It actually brought the total down to about $75. I believe that included shipping. I can't really remember, but it is an extremely cheap setup, and it's particularly amazing to do if for any reason you are like me, in which case you owned an SP01 or a CZ75 for that matter that you purchased just as is because it was a great price, and you're like, well, I want to upgrade the trigger for not a lot of money. I want to get shadow performance without dropping the money instantly for shadows. It's just mainly so you don't have to get rid of your firearm or drop all the money all at once for a shadow. However, it is worth noting that if you do this conversion, you will not be able to run it in IDPA, IPSC, or USPSA production. I believe there's other USPSA divisions that will allow this modification, but the majority of the situation is because we're deleting the firing pin block safety, it's kind of a no-no, so just keep that in mind. If you do want to convert it to the shadow level, go ahead and watch this video, but would like to still retain the firing pin block safety. Go ahead and watch this series of videos. Watch the first one and the second one just to get an idea of what you're going for. And I already have a video out of how to do a short reset system from Cajun Gunworks into an SP01, as this will allow you to retain firing pin block safety, but it'll also allow you to run the shadow hammer. There's a few geometry differences that if you actually put a shadow hammer into the firearm and you just leave the firing pin block in there, you will have an extremely longer reset than you had in the first place. CZs already are known for having a slightly longer reset than instead of just being at the wall, but if you put a shadow hammer, it's really going to exaggerate that reset, and you definitely should either consider removing the firing pin block altogether or running the short reset system from Cajun Gunworks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and start working on the firearm. Now, of course, I do have to insert a disclaimer here. This video is not exactly a how-to. This is what I did to convert my CZ75 into a shadow model. I am not responsible for anything that happens. You are in charge of your firearm. You know what you're doing to it. And if you don't, then take it to a competent gunsmith. So the first thing we're going to do is to do the slide. Slide comes out, and we can set the frame aside because we'll get to that later. Start with the recoil spring, remove that, and then the barrel, get it out of the way. First thing we're going to do to this slide is actually pull or push that roll pin out of there so we can remove this firing pin block right here. Now, keep in mind that if you're going to do all of this and you plan on running this gun on either IDPA or USPSA production, you need to retain that safety plunger, which is why the shadow model would be a better option for USPSA production because, you know, well, it's factory, that's how it comes. This is a modification that removes the safety, so it's a big no-no in USPSA production and IDPA. However, you can still run it in USPSA limited 10, I believe, and several others. Let's get started. Now, hopefully I don't have to use my vise. I'm just going to use the bench block. You're going to need a 3mm punch for this. In this case, this is a Sig Sauer 3mm firing pin or retaining pin punch. It's actually cupped, but this thing's so brutally hard that it really doesn't care. So put your finger behind it to prevent the firing pin from shooting out, which it won't, but still a good idea. Firing pin gets pushed out. Next thing you do is push the plunger down, and that releases the firing pin, at which point you can start pulling it up. You gotta put your finger over this one now. Still didn't come out. Do it again. Firing pin comes out. Plunger comes out with its spring. Come on. There you go. I don't know why it's stuck. Apparently it's magnetic. Let's take a look at this spring. Everything looks good. If anything, a little dirty. Let's clean this area up a little bit. and this area. Now the way the Shadow ones actually retain is they actually don't have that roll pin. Shadows actually have a plate on the back like a 1911 because it doesn't have the safety plunger. Now the other thing we're going to look at, which is really common with CZs, is look at the firing pin, retaining pin. It looks a little damaged, not too terrible. Either way, it's getting replaced. So that gets pushed out. Firing pin. This would be replaced if you were going with a lighter hammer spring. In this case, 15 pounds is actually still pretty good. We're going to test it out, see if you need anything lower. But according to Shadow models, Shadows actually use the factory standard one. And if 14 to 14 and a half is good, then 15 pounds should be pretty good for it as well. So let's just put it back together. Obviously, use this guy. And then you're going to have to align that notch with this hole when it comes to this. Actually, should probably start the roll pin before I start doing that. So here's my little bag of roll pins. I ordered 2 because I need to replace another one on another gun. And start pushing it in. Double check that it'll go through, which it does. Starting to go. Because I'm gonna have to hold it in somehow while I do this. This 3mm punch to hold it in. There we go. So that's holding it in. Yeah, I'm gonna have to do this out video. You guys are gonna have to wait for me, but this is what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna hold this in while I tap this other one in. I'm gonna do it on the vise, so just give me a second, I'll be right back. So we are back. Roll pin is in. Looking at it, I kind of didn't notice that this side was a little bit flared, which means that it would have been easier if I had just gone in through here instead of the other side. Either way, doesn't matter. It's just easier from this side, so just keep that in mind if you're doing this. See, there's no longer a firing pin plunger, and I still have full movement of the firing pin. So there you go. That is the firing pin itself. Then moving on, let's clear this out for a second. Actually, before I go too far ahead, the method that I ended up doing was putting the punch through the other side, tapping it in until the firing pin itself was now held by the pin itself, by the firing pin retaining pin, instead of this. Keep in mind that if you do it while being held on a vise, use something like these, which basically prevent marring of the slide once you clamp it down. I did actually lose the firing pin twice in the bedroom because it shot out. Highly recommend putting a piece of duct tape around the back so it doesn't fly out when you're hammering it in, because when you hammer it in, you accidentally actually push this down at the same time, so it just kind of flies out. Anyway, that was extremely fun. So let's move on. This is the firing pin plunger and the firing pin plunger spring, which we're no longer going to be needing, so we'll set it over here and move on. So now that that's in, we're going to put our barrel in, and the next step in the modification is a recoil spring and a guide rod. The guide rod, the reason I chose to buy a different guide rod is from CZ, the original guide rod and spring is this flat wire spring, and it's got this really skinny plastic guide rod. I've got nothing against plastic guide rods, but when you replace the spring, which is, I don't even know what the poundage is, I've read somewhere around 20 online. I'm probably wrong, but that's what I've read. If you replace just the recoil spring, you'll notice that these are round wire springs. Even this is a factory Shadow recoil spring from CZ, which you can buy at CZ Custom, but you'll notice there's a lot of wobble. It's not exactly properly fitting, and these tend to get a little twisted. So these tend to work well with the flat wire spring, but nothing else. So when you order a Shadow recoil spring, it's wise for you to upgrade the guide rod. And in this case, it's thicker on the back and thinner at the front because it still has to make its way through that hole, which is, you know, definitely thinner than the rest of the guide rod. So this kind of does the balancing effect. If you notice, this will be properly guided, and then the spring itself will be enclosed inside there, so it'll move smoothly without any issues. But it's like a $3 part. Honestly, it's worthwhile. So take your guide rod, shove it in with the recoil spring, shove it into the slide, and then there's the new recoil spring guide rod. You can see it's perfectly straight. There's nothing moving out of place. And that's the end of that. That's your Shadow conversion for the slide. This is where shit gets tricky. So I've actually got a few other things that we're going to do to this. We're going to start with the Sear Safety. The Sear lifter is what it's called. There's this little lifter right there. You'll see it come up if I pull the trigger. That is your firing pin block lifter. That can actually do 2 things. One, it increases the weight of the trigger. Actually, it does 3. It increases the weight. It makes the trigger not feel as good because you actually, before you get to the wall, you actually hit it and you can see it moving slightly. So you can actually feel that in the trigger. It's pretty pronounced if you go slow. If you go fast, I mean, technically you still feel it. And then the third thing it does is if we put this in the situation where it's about to reset, you start letting go of the trigger, letting go of the trigger, letting go of the trigger, and then it clicks. The reason it clicks is because it bypasses that lever first before it gets to the sear. So we fit there, and then the take up is actually the lifter arm. Let's do it again. Release, 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 release. and then the take up is the lifter arm. You can see it move. So if we get rid of that lifter arm, like the Shadow series does, then that solves the reset issue being a longer reset, where basically you reset and then you still have a little bit of take up on the trigger. If we delete it, it'll be reset and you'll be on the wall, or at least close to it. It really depends per model, but that's kind of the goal. So let's move on. First things first, let's remove those grips. Once the grips have removed, we're going to remove this mag brake, which is a little tricky to remove if you've never disassembled it, but if you've already disassembled it, there's a modification you can do where it's really easy to get out. Push it out. There's this little pin right there. It only comes out one direction in my CZ. I don't know if this is all specific to all the CZs out there, the CZ75s, but it just kind of springs out and then you can pull it out. You can't do that on a new model. There'll be this little spring that coils down that actually catches on the spring plug, so you can't just remove like that. You would ideally remove that pin and then let the mag brake just kind of hang there, and then while it hangs there, you undo the spring plug. And the spring plug you're going to do by pressing against the table, and then you're going to push out this pin with another punch. Push down on it, push this pin out, and then slowly back off. Spring plug, hammer spring. So this we're not going to use anymore. These we are going to use again. Let's set those aside. I could probably put them over there, but I'm not going to lose them. So then next step. So now there's nothing holding this hammer on or against. You can still cock it and everything, but there's nothing else happening. So I have found that when you try to disassemble it, the Sear cage, which is the next step, it's kind of hard to get that little spring, this spring right here. That spring is what's holding your thumb safety, at least in the majority of the models. I'm not really sure on the thumb safeties on the right hand side in certain models. I know CZ75s only have it on the left side, not the right, so this is applicable to yours, and probably all of them, honestly. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But it's kind of hard to catch. If you actually put it on safe, it actually lifts that little spring up enough. And you can kind of just catch it, and then with your fingernail, you're gonna lift up that little spring. It worked on safe for me, so you might as well just do it on the safe position. So now this spring is permanently up. You can keep pulling on the safety, and then the safety can come up. If you have an SP01, you can clock this a certain way and it'll come out. Yep, just like that. You clock it up and it comes out. There's this little tab in there holding it that you don't want to lose, so just keep an eye out for that, which is why we're just going to leave the frame aside, and all we really need is this guy, which is captive. And it's only captive on the safety models. The decocker models, whole different story, I don't want to get into it, but it's fairly simple on the safety models. So we're going to try and leave this in a position where it's not going to fall down. Move it out of the way because I don't want to lose those. And what I mean by those is I mean the safety plunger, which is right there, and then the locking tab for the right hand safety, which is over here. So let's move that out of the way. Moving forward, the thing that we're actually replacing in here is the firing pin lifter itself, and we're putting a little spacer on it. Now, if you remember the little firing pin lifter, it's this little guy. What you can see over here is this guy. And this is a firing pin. So that's where your take up comes in. The whole bar will slide back. This is the rear side of the gun, and this is the front side of the gun. The whole trigger bar will come back on reset, and then it'll go click and it'll land there. And the first thing it hits is the firing pin lifter, which is why it has a longer reset, and then it hits the wall. And it pulls both of them at the same time. So if you get rid of this, then it's just the Sear. So it actually does a lot. So the way we're gonna do this is we're actually gonna push it in from right to left so that the only thing that comes out is the lifter itself. We're already there, and firing pin lifter just comes out, and there's a little spring. This is a tiny little spring itself. Be careful with that, you might lose it. So let's put it in the magnet just so we don't lose it, and then that's it for that. The next step, which is the firing pin lifter spacer. I keep saying that name, sorry. There's two companies that sell it that I know of. It's CZ Custom and Cajun Gunworks. I don't know if this is aluminum or not. Probably is. It's not magnetic. Might be stainless. It actually has a tint like stainless, but I really don't know. I really didn't verify. I know that Cajun Gunworks is aluminum, but I was ordering everything from CZ Custom, so I ordered this with it. Save your money wherever you're ordering from. Again, everything I ordered was from CZ Custom. So your next goal is to slide this guy where that lifter was. I'm gonna push it in. We're gonna try and align it over here. Oh, there we go. So now it's through the spacer itself, but now we need to get the Sear to align with the cage. There we go. So let's make sure that the Sear is still moving as it should, which it is. That's pretty much all there's left in there. Push this down. It seems to be flat now. And that's it for the firing pin, or the lifter spacer. Again, double check, make sure your Sear's still moving, which it is. That is it, at least for the Sear cage. Disassembly will have to happen again, because when we fit the new hammer, the sear will actually be out of alignment with the safety. And considering the safety is easier to fit because all you have to do is take the thumb safety out, but the sear is actually the cheaper component of all of it. I think it's an $18 sear, so we are going to be filing the sear itself later once I get the new hammer. So we can go from here, and then there's no point in putting this in because we're going to have to take the hammer out. All right, so that is the end of part one. The reason I chose to end it here is because at this point you can just throw the hammer spring in, put the firearm back together, and you're good to go. You now improved your trigger substantially. It now has better take up, better break, and a better reset from the factory. You will notice that your break, if you reduce the hammer spring, your break will actually be a little bit creepier, which is where the shadow hammer comes in. But nonetheless, your trigger should be miles ahead of what it used to be. Now, part two is when things get a little bit more complicated. It's gonna be tedious work, and I do recommend you watch the entire video because I did it the more lengthy way in order to save money in case of a screw up. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button, stay tuned for part two, and I'll see you guys later.